bad about small towns, but we're in a small town, and look at this turnout of people from all walks of life, and this says a lot. That's very meaningful. So thank you. And I'm sorry about the glitch earlier as we were trying to figure out this screen. I was going to ask you some questions about the next slides, but you've already seen it, so my surprise has been broken. The bio that she read said that I went to the Dartmouth School, and I didn't realize I was wearing a shirt tonight, so that tells you a little bit about what that is. So, who here has heard of Montpelier? Just raise your hand by show of hands. Okay, so maybe a little less than half the people. Has anyone been there? One person, okay. 2 people, that's right, 2 people. Great. I know you've been there, Joe. Wrote a book about it. So, how many people know what is special? It's kind of in the slide. What's special about Montpelier is in our history? What makes it a special place? Anyone want to just throw it out?
Well, I'm a historical archaeologist, so I think work that you've done is what makes it special.
That's very kind of you. You've heard something about the work we've done. Okay, great. Okay, that's wonderful. Well, why don't you continue? What does most of the world know about Montpelier? James Madison. Okay. And this is a question. I see some young people here tonight. This is very young people. So maybe this is not the best question to ask, but do you know? And I'm volunteering for this. Do you know what James Madison? What he's known for? Okay. Well, he was known for being the father of the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution. So you see that picture, which I took in the front. This upper story room right there. If you go to Montpelier, great tour, great beautiful place to go. You should go visit it. Everyone should go. It's a place of pilgrimage, and I'm going to tell you why. Not the official reason why. I'm going to tell you the real reason why. But in that room up there, in the second floor, that's where he sat at his desk. And on his bookshelf were a bunch of books that he read, spanning 2,000 years of history. And he read the classics, and he read, he really studied the origin of democracy, the Greeks, the Romans, amazing books. And we still have his books there. A lot of them are reproductions. But he formulated the concepts, the framework of our Constitution. And there is no question that he was a genius. He was an unusually smart human being. And he went to school at a very young age, taught by the best teachers. In the 18th century, there was no public school. You went, if you had money, you had private tutors who would come to your house. So his class of American were the very, very top in terms of income. We've done a study, we've calculated what his wealth would be worth today, and he would be a billionaire. That plantation sits on about 4,000, a little bit more than that, acres of rolling hill. He planted tobacco, corn, wheat, until the soil got depleted. Then he did something else after that, and we'll talk about that. Where did all that money come from? How did he afford, as smart as he was, how was he the one that rose? Well, that's the rest of the story, the deeper Upper Story. That's what we're going to talk about tonight. Okay? So James Madison, we'll talk a little bit about his education because there's some important things to say. But James Madison had his family, so his father's father, Ambrose, was granted a charter from the King of England, this is in colonial times, of thousands of acres out in what was the frontier. Like this place for a long time was the frontier. Before it was just Virginia. It was the Blue Ridge Mountains. And folks had really not gone out there and explored. They hadn't colonized it yet. They hadn't captured it. There were people living there. They were Native Americans, the Monacans. And he got his grandfather, Ambrose, got a charter from the king. And he organized a group, the Golden Horseshoe, it's called. And they went out and they kind of surveyed it, charted it, and then it became a matter of who gets the land, who gets to sell it, who gets to keep the profits, who gets to use it, and how do you use it. So he ended up with about 4,000, 45,000 acres of some of the most fertile land in the world, not just in America, but in the world. It's a landmass that begins up in New Jersey, and it's a high copper base. There's a lot of copper in the soil. So if you go there, you'll see the land is like orange tinged, it's brownish orange. You could throw anything on it, it grows. Very, very fertile soil. They really lucked out. He was born, Madison, was born on the eastern shore of Virginia, where the colonists first kind of settled. And his father's father sent a bunch of enslaved people to this property, and they lived there for 10 years with overseers just to prepare it for them. They really had never lived there. And they came out finally after they were told it's ready. They came out and they didn't build that house, they built a smaller house. Not far from there, maybe about 50 yards from there. And thus began this dynasty that really shaped our country. I won't get it, I'm not here tonight to tell the story of James Madison, so I'm going to shift over. But you notice in the title here, what does it say? Something about that strike you? That title that's the logo of Montpelier. That logo tells you who it belongs to, whose Montpelier is. It's his Montpelier. It's not someone else's. It's his. And we're going to question that tonight. Whose Montpelier is it? Okay? If I can get this thing to do what I want it to do. Tell you a little bit about the region. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about me. So, in early America, so from the colonial period up until the early 19th century, this dotted line here, you take a dotted line from, say, Fredericksburg down to Richmond, and you notice there's water. There's two rivers. And out in the very edge on the left side, you know what's out there? Anybody? Those are the Blue Ridge Mountains. That was the frontier. Has anyone seen the Blue Ridge Mountains before? Heard of them? Beautiful place. Really should go camping there if you can. That area, I kind of I gave it this nickname, the Ark. And I call it the Ark of Enslaved Communities. Because within that community, within that area, several hundred square miles, was the richest part of America during the early American period. Part of it was due to some of the soil I told you about. Part of it was due to the fact that these are highways. So if you own big plantations, you can get your goods to market. Richmond, the James goes into the Chesapeake Bay. So does this. This is the Rappahannock River, and it goes into the Chesapeake Bay. Then you have you have access to Europe, and you can sell your goods, import, export. That was the richest area in early America. So we would expect, wouldn't we, that the people who put their stamp on America came from there. The richest people there. What was the wealth based upon? Anybody? Anybody know? Anybody have a guess?
Labor.
Well, yes, labor, but before labor, it was agricultural wealth, right? And labor, there's no agriculture without labor. In those days, in that region, what type of labor was it? Exactly, it was all stolen labor, I like to call it. So it was based upon stolen labor. Not only the richest part of America, but America, remember, was part of an empire, part of the British Empire, the richest empire in the world. And this was the richest part of that empire. Well, it slowly became it. Started off in Barbados, another slavery-based economy. But it started migrating up here, and soon this was the richest part of the richest, most powerful empire on earth. Now let's look at this. So you have Montpelier up here. We'll skip Barbersville, and then you have Monticello over here, about 17 miles away. Anybody heard of Monticello? Read the crowd, James. We're in Monticello. Okay. So, who's from Monticello? Who do you associate? His best friend, Madison's buddy. There's a little road that goes from Montpelier to Monticello, goes right through Barbersville. It's an ancient road. It used to be a buffalo trace, basically, where buffaloes used to go and migrate back, seasonally to the mountains to graze. And the Monacan used it as well, and eventually the colonists used it. Well, that little road, Madison used to go visit Jefferson. Jefferson founded Charlottesville, University of Virginia. That's where this place is. And now I'm going to talk about Barbersville. So between these two, you have Barbersville. Barbersville was named, does anybody, this is like a serious bonus question. If someone gets this right, you get a star. Who was Barbersville named after? Anybody? Yeah, Barber. A dude named Barber. So anybody know a dude named Barber?
Is it Samuel?
I'm sorry?
Is it Samuel?
I think there is a Samuel in the family, but the Barbers have since kind of migrated and moved all over, some down to Mississippi nearby. That's named after the 18th governor of Virginia, James Barber. During the War of 1812, you guys have heard of that? When the British came to Washington and burned the White House, he was governor, and he was kind of like Minister of Defense, if you will, of Virginia. He sent out his troops, and they got the Brits embarrassed him. And later he was a senator. He was in his day, a very prominent senator. He founded the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And then he was named as an ambassador to England. So he went to the UK and was just there for a year in a very 1827, 1828, very interesting time, very interesting period to be in England. Barber was a huge landowner and a huge slave owner. And all three of those families were. There was another family in the middle between Montpelier and Barbersville named the Newmans. They owned all the land, thousands of enslaved people between them, rich people, not good at managing their money. Jefferson died in debt. Madison had some serious money problems himself, even though he had $1 billion. And Barber, his family, was extremely wealthy. I've looked at all their records when they lived in England. They would go to England and go shopping on Regent Street in London, the most expensive stuff you can imagine. And they would fill up crates and they would ship it back to Barbersville. So the Barbers, the Madisons, and the Newmans owned thousands of enslaved people. And they also had children with those enslaved people. What do you think became of those children? Do you think they freed them? You think they said, "You're my child? You're okay? Move in the house, here's a room"? No, they owned them and they enslaved them, their own children. I'm a descendant of those children. So I just wanted to fit my story into the story I'm going to tell you tonight. So I'm a descendant of two enslaved people through my mother's father's side, of James Barber and James Newman. All the Newmans, the Barbers, and the Madisons, and the Jeffersons, they intermarried, and so did the community of the people they enslaved. They all intermarried. So it was the difference was one community was, the power differential was exponentially different. It wasn't a little bit different, it was unimaginably different. So I'm a descendant of Priscilla and J. Albert. His name is Brown now, but he was a barber. I'll get into that a little bit later. So I just wanted to give you that little background. So what I just told you was there's a community of people who were enslaved, and they had children. I'm one of them, or several generations down. And we call that community a descendant community. Now, you had mentioned, Matthew, earlier a book called The Rubric, or a piece of scholarship that was developed at Montpelier in 2018. It was at the National Summit for Teaching Slavery. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about that in a second. But on page 1 of the rubric, which is a methodology for institutions to do a self-evaluation. So institutions, I mean museums, foundations, historic sites. Okay? It's kind of a methodology that says, how well are you doing this? Are you engaging with descendant communities that built your site? And it's extremely well done. But on page 1, it has a definition of a descendant community. So a descendant community is a group of people whose ancestors were enslaved at a particular site, but it can transcend that limited definition. A descendant community can include those whose ancestors were enslaved not only at the site, but also throughout the surrounding region, reflecting the fact that family ties often cross plantation boundaries. Does that make sense to everybody? So, what does that really say? Anybody have a thought on that? Like, what is that? The essence of that? Well, to me, what it means is it's saying that a community is not defined by property boundaries. That people are not property. People are people. Property is this other thing over there, right? So the fact that the plantation has a boundary on a map that's sitting in a courthouse doesn't really mean anything about the people in there, right? What defines the people, what defines you, is your community, your family, your relationships amongst each other, who you interact with, who you go to school with, who you date, who you marry, who you have children with. That's your community, right? Same thing. So, as simple as that sounds, that was groundbreaking. Because what the rubric was doing was saying there's no blood test in historical interpretation. We're not going to reflect as what the slave owners did and thought and convinced themselves. We're not going to reflect that as we define a community. We're not going to reflect this idea of property ownership. We're going to, through archaeological research, through anthropology, through historical research, we're going to dig and interview people and find out what the stories are, what the narratives are, what the community that created this wealth, what their actual history is. We're going to tell the untold story. So that is what should now question this idea of James Madison's Montpelier. He was just a single property owner who was at the top of the pile. But he had no special importance for the community, right? He benefited from that community. So the way I look at this is that everything that Madison became, he became because he was part of that community. And that doesn't limit itself to just, to monetary things. What it means is, imagine his family enslaved 300 people for 140 years, several generations. Imagine he's on horseback or he's riding or he's in his thinking process, he goes out and he interacts with people. People don't just part in ways. They're talking to them. He's talking to people and people know what he's doing and he's interacting with them. He's interacting with people in his house, people who he owns in his mind, enslaved people. So there's a social contract, a social relationship. He's gaining something other than his stolen labor. He's gaining culture from the community. He's part of that culture. So, all right, so we got some ideas. I just wanted to throw this out. Now I'm going to tell you the story. So, I grew up in Africa. You heard a little bit about that. My dad was a doctor when I was a little kid. I told you that this is my mother's side of the family. He and my mother met. He was a student at Howard University studying medicine back during the war, World War II. And they met and fell in love. And they courted at Barboursville. She would bring him home. And this is this dude I'm seeing. And her dad was a doctor himself. And his father was enslaved. So my grandfather's father was enslaved. And he married my grandfather's father married a girl from Barboursville. Okay? And what amazes me is that my grandfather, who I never met, he died before I was born, a child of an enslaved person. The Barbers are no longer there. They're gone as soon as the war ended, the Civil War. They could not survive. Their business model broke down. Who rose and who fell? The people who owned people before the war fell economically. The people who they owned, quote unquote, rose. So my grandfather, one generation from slavery, went to Harvard. I never met the man. I don't know how that happened. But I know something happened, and I'm going to give you my best guess tonight. Okay? And he became a doctor. He became a Buffalo soldier. In World War I, he went to Europe and he fought against the German in his, it was segregated back then in the army. Anybody hear of the Buffalo Soldiers before? He wrote letters home to my grandmother, beautiful love letters. I took them with me to France, rented a car, drove across, and I went through every village he went through. And I went to the church, and I went to the historical society, and it was like they remembered him. It was unbelievable. So my grandfather, the day before yesterday, I read something from him. It was his obituary my mother wrote. She was saying how much he loved Barboursville. I had been living in Africa. I was living in South Africa. I grew up in West Africa. I lived in South Africa for about a decade. And in 2018, I moved back to the US. And I was hanging out in Barboursville. We still own the property there that my great-great-grandfather, I should have told you part of this story. It's actually important. So I told you his father owned him. His wife's father owned her. He struck a deal with both their parents and said, he said, if I pay you for our freedom and I pay you for the land, will you sell it to me? And it took them a long time to both families to come to an agreement. They accepted it. So he spent the rest of his life, up until the war, working as a cobbler, making shoes, paying off his debt, and built a house. We own that house right now. I slept in that house 2 nights ago. So this is very recent history for all of us. And I say, I'm talking about me, but this is your story. This is not just my story. This is all of our stories. This is living history. I came back from South Africa. I got an email from someone who worked at Montpelier and said, hey, we're having a meeting of Descendants. Why don't you come along? And I didn't even know what Descendant meant. I hadn't read this before. I knew my family's history. I knew some of the other people in Barbersville's history because we have cousins there. My mother, who was an amazing, brilliant historian, she had recently passed. So I didn't really have an idea of my relationship to Montpelier, which was just 6 miles away. I had to pass it every time I went to Barbersville. So, went to this meeting. I met a bunch of people like me, Descendants, other people with names that I heard my mother talk about all my life. And here they are, and they were all amazing. Just, Dr. Blakey, I'm sure you may have heard of him. Joseph, you've heard of him. Michael Blakey, one of the top anthropologists in the country. Rebecca Coleman, there's a Coleman here in the audience. Betty Pierce, who just recently wrote a book called The Other Madisons. Her family history is that she's descendant of James Madison. James Madison, the president. A lot of people know the story of the Jennings, Thomas Jefferson. You should read her book, The Other Madisons. She tells the story of her descendants from James Madison himself. So I went there, and there was a presentation of the rubric, and by Dr. Blakey and others, and it just blew my mind. And I just came like tonight, beautiful food, a lot of lovely people. I just came to be part of the event. And the question was asked amongst the descendants, what do you want to do? We have, for 20 years, been associated with Montpelier. There's been a lot of work, to be fair. There has been an award-winning exhibit called The Mere Distinction of Color that talked about the enslaved community. There had been Dr. Matt Reeves, who's a brilliant archaeologist, had done a lot of excavation, had excavated the south yard back behind this mansion, or the mansion that you saw in the previous picture. And that's where there was this little kind of village that Madison had, basically for his 24-hour on-call, kitchen. And it looked very, like you go there today, nice houses, all painted white. He was like, oh, slavery wasn't that bad. This looks good. He did that on purpose because he wanted his visitors to think that he was this really generous, benevolent, as if there could be, benevolent slave owner. Matt Reeves excavated it, rebuilt the houses. There had been a lot of recognition that Montpelier was trying to tell the story of slavery ethically. But there was another side to the story, and this is what we discussed. 100 people worked at Montpelier. After 20 years, and Montpelier is a fairly big institution. 1 black employee. After 20 years, 1 black employee. And 1 black board member. Now, if you go through the process of the rubric and you evaluate the organization, Montpelier did look awful. What it looked like was that they were portraying themselves to the country as being very conscientious about their whole history. But what they weren't doing was showing it in the institution itself, the institutional structure. Who made decisions? Who had power? Why is it still 99 to 1, even on the employee staff level? Right? And so we formed an organization that night to interact with them formally. And for some reason, I was slow to walk out of the room. I ended up being elected chairman. And here I am. And that was 4 years ago. That was 2019. I went to the Kat Imhoff. She was the CEO at the time, lovely woman. She was frustrated with the board. I introduced myself to her, and I thought, what I need to do is really get on the foundation board. Otherwise, I'm just some pressure group guy with a fancy title. And so when I went to see Kat Imhoff, I thought, let me go demand a place on this board. Walked in her office, reached out my arm, and before she shook my hand, she said, James, you should be on the board. She disarmed me, and we became really close. So I had an ally. You need allies. I had an ally, and I knew that we were going to make change together. I got on the board. But as soon as I got on the board, 2 months later, she resigned. And so did the current chairman. And then he was sick and he had to get treatment, but she got a new job and wanted to do a career change, and couldn't be angry at her. But I was all alone now on that board, and I hadn't even met the other board members. Well, I soon met them. And it turned out that they were very powerful people, mostly from Richmond, the capital, wealthy, and they weren't that interested in what I had to say. And so I like to tell this story to give you, I'm going really slow in this story, I apologize. But I like to tell this little anecdote. My first interaction with the chairman of the time, or the interim chairman, called him up. Hey James, how you doing? Can't wait to meet you. I just wanted to let you know that little organization of yours that you just founded, it's interesting. We're going to come up with a policy, and we're going to treat all third-party stakeholders the same. You know, organizations like yours and the Thoroughbred Horse Society. So, my first conversation, he compared the Descendants with horses. That was indicative of how he saw us. That rubbed me the wrong way. So I knew this was going to be an intense relationship. Fast forward, we're now in early 2020. What big thing happened in May of 2020? Anybody? What's that? George Floyd. George Floyd was murdered. I was in Detroit at the time, also the beginning of COVID, right? So everything's locked down. I'm in Detroit. And Montpelier puts up on its website a statement. Remember you guys, remember this, like corporations and institutions, universities, were all making these statements, you know, and some of them were thought out, some of them were a little bit funny. And I thought, surely they would consult with the Descendants before making a statement. They didn't. They put up a very bland statement that meant nothing. And my phone just blew up. So now I'm getting complaints from all the Descendants. James, do something. Do something. So what I did was, I'm chair of this entity called the Montpelier Descendants Committee, which I named after something that Madison named himself, or it's actually his dad did during the US Revolution. During the Revolution, Madison created a committee of public safety, and that for Virginia, the Virginia Committee of Public Safety. And that was a military committee to strategize how they're going to support the revolution militarily. Well, I named our organization the Montpelier Descendants Committee to strategize how we were going to interact with this foundation that just called us horses. So I looked deeper into the rubric, and I found a very powerful concept in the rubric called structural parity. And structural parity is essentially, I mean, I'll read the fancy words, is that it's part of the evaluation process, but it's to see how well the descendant community is represented and empowered at every level of the board, of the institution, from the board really all the way down to the volunteers. Are they tokens? Are there scholarships? Are there things that are offered? Does it reflect the history of the enslaved community and their voices? Is it integrated into the institution, or is it tokenized? I read that as really all I needed to read into this was the word parity, because parity has a meaning. Parity means equal. That's all. I mean, that's what, look it up. It means equal. And so what this really means is that it's asking, are descendants equal? Do they have equal power and equal decision-making authority at the institution? Looked into that, and I called a meeting of the descendants, and I said, I think this is what we should do. We're being treated as horses. We're not being consulted when there's this historic moment. We're all reasonable people. We should just stop asking politely, because it's not a matter of being civil. I mean, we had more, on the MDC, we had more PhDs and doctors and lawyers and everything than the board did. You know, everyone's polite. That wasn't the issue. There was something else. They didn't want to, I wonder what it was. There was something else. And they didn't want to listen to us. So what we did is we looked into this notion of structural parity. Now, it's really interesting, because for me, structural parity at Montpelier is really special. Because what's the other document at Montpelier that Montpelier is known for? It's known for the Constitution. This is the second document ever. I mean, Montpelier's never published another document. And this document, the rubric, talks about structural parity. And it's kind of like the Constitution, right? The Constitution says we're all equal. And we should organize ourselves on a basis of all having an equal voice through our votes. All of us, without distinction. So it resonated, it echoed. So we used that as our rallying cry, and thus began a 3-year journey to attain structural parity and equal voice, and it had to start at the board. So that's what we did. And this is just some shots of what the rubric looks like. So the rubric kind of asks you to, in 3 different pillars, and this pillar is multidisciplinary research. How do you you give it to the institution, ask them to do an audit of themselves, and however they want to organize their evaluating methodology, and score themselves from exemplary all the way down to unsatisfactory on each of these levels. So you'll see some of the sources and methodology. What sources is the institution looking at to come to make decisions about which artifacts to display, what stories to tell. And then you do this through, just going through the 3 pillars. This pillar is called relationship building, okay? So, do you have high standards in your relationships with internally and externally? Do you have an express commitment to the descendant community? These are all, this sounds vague, but if you read the rubric, it's all defined in that. You'll see the 3rd one is structural parity, sitting there right in the middle of the pillar of relationship building. And this last one is interpretation. How is the interpretation of the site scored? And these, again, are the measures: multidimensional representation of people, descendant community engagement, institutional commitment. That's really about, is it tokenism or is it real? And so this is what the rubric looks like. I think I'm gonna pause here and just kind of tell a little bit of a story. So it was really difficult. For 3 years, what we did was we asked to redo that statement about George Floyd. We asked the board to do it, they refused. They didn't, and I was on the board, they refused. They felt, unfortunately, this is a really sad thing, because we had a moment there that was really important, to be partners and to collaborate. And that's what all we were asking them to do. But they had a view of their own power as zero sum, meaning that they felt that if they shared it, they would lose some. They saw power as a pizza. And if I give you a slice, oh, I got one less slice for me. And we went through mediations, we had experts come and talk to the board. We didn't spare any effort. I had to raise ungodly sums of money to pay for the lawyers, for the experts, for all of the people to come to try to solve this in a very amicable way. And it wasn't working. They would not budge from this notion that they're somehow losing power if they shared it. Now, I look at power in a very different way. I look at power not as a pizza. I look at power, I think in my mind, I make a mental image. And I think of there being a table, like a boardroom table. Imagine there's a boardroom with a nice oak table and people sitting at it. And there are a bunch of people outside who, been trying to make it to the table for years and generations, and they're never let in. Now, for whatever reason, if they are let into the room, you can think of what's going to happen next in two different ways. One will be the pizza way. You're losing some power. There's another way to look at it. That the people coming in to sit down at that table are going to share their power with you. So in fact, you're gaining power. And that's what life's really like. Remember the community. You're gaining power. Madison gained cultural power from others. And I'll give you a nice little anecdote about that. So, took us 3 years. There were a lot of fits and starts. A lot of money was spent. A lot of it made a lot of news. It was in all the, it was in the Washington Post, the New York Times. It was on Fox News. It was all over. Because remember, this is where Madison wrote the Constitution, so this is of interest to some people. And it was a very stressful time of my life personally. And it was very instructive for me, because I learned how most people see power, and I saw that they were missing it. And this is the point I really want to convey to you tonight. As you go through your lives, as young people grow up, as you go throughout the world, the way I would ask you to see power, and the way that I would ask you to look at institutions. The common history of slavery in this country is that, and you see it here, is that a terrible atrocity occurred that involved powerful people stealing labor and objectifying people with no power, and that's true. But that's not the whole story. The people who were enslaved here did more than give their labor. They gave their minds. They were sentient, intelligent people like anyone else. The people who owned this plantation didn't do the work. I would say they didn't know how to do the work. Someone knew how to do the work. Someone knew, it wasn't just go out and pick this up and put it over there. They knew how to turn land into wealth. They knew how to grow the crops that became wealth that they never shared in, not a single day of their lives. They knew how to solve problems that others could not even understand, couldn't diagnose. And they solved them, and they spent their lives doing that. That's knowledge. That's more than just stolen labor, right? That's sentient, that's genius. I was telling Matthew earlier today that in the 1820s, Montpelier, like that part of Virginia, the soil started to become depleted. And the crops of the time, wheat, tobacco, these crops, it became impossible to plant them anymore. But that also coincided with the opening up of this part of the country. The Louisiana Purchase had been concluded. President Jackson had committed atrocities and cleared the land of Native Americans. The US government was basically acquiring land and selling it to people in places like this became settled. The international transatlantic slave trade had stopped after, what was it, is it 1808? 1808? So that meant there's still slavery here. Where did the people come from? They came from places like Virginia, where the soil was depleted. So people like Madison, instead of planting, what did they sell after in the 1820s? They sold people. Mostly children. And very young children were sent in coffles, in other words, chained. They didn't take a boat to get here. They walked. A lot of them, or at least down to like Alabama and Mississippi. Maybe some here came through New Orleans, I'm not quite sure. But that's how people came here to work in these fields. What was happening back at Montpelier during that time? Well, the soil was depleted. And that meant that even if you wanted to plant, it wouldn't grow. There's a really harrowing but beautiful story of Montpelier I want to share with you tonight. There's a hillside in what we call the East Woods that is now covered with a forest. And Madison's father used to plant tobacco there. Tobacco's it's a crop that really is hard on the soil, depletes the soil very quickly. It has to go fallow. It has to go fallow for like 20 years before you can plant it again. So it quickly becomes exhausted. And every year it would rain, and the nutrients would go down the bottom of the hill. The bottom of the hill was covered in water, though. It was like a swamp, almost like the bayou out here. And the people who we enslaved, the 300 people, saw what was happening. They saw that the planting was going down, but the breaking up of families was going up. And so people's families were being broken up, and the family was set, like Madison, literally, was selling people's children. And so they thought very quickly, what do we have to do? Labor alone is not going to stop it. What we got to do is we got to find a way to make this place profitable so he doesn't have to sell our children. So what they did was they went down to the bottom of this, where all the water is. That's where all the rich soil is. And you had two choices. You either have to move the soil back to the top of the hill, or move the water out of the way so you can plant in that soil at the bottom of the hill. They chose the latter. And they dug these quarter-mile parallel canals that removed the water and allowed Madison to plant tobacco again. And it extended the time they could spend with their children. That's knowledge. At Montpelier, we have records, and we have a letter from Madison to Jefferson. Madison wrote him a letter and said, Tommy, I heard you're going to Philly. There's this book I want you to get. And this book was written by the top rhetoricist, professor of rhetoric, one of the 5 original liberal arts. Actually, I think there were 3, then it got expanded to 5. But rhetoric was the top liberal art. It was the most refined. You know, you had all of the, you had, you know, Mathematica and all of the other ones. But unless you had studied rhetoric, you didn't know how to express yourself in the way that during the Enlightenment was prized. And so if you were a child of Madison or Jefferson, you would read from that book because that was the top book that everyone wanted. It was #1 on Amazon at the time. And Jefferson said, yeah, I'll go, I'll get you a copy. He probably wanted some 2, 3, 4 for himself, because that's the book to have. And in our house in Barbersville, the one that I told you about earlier, luckily we're very fortunate. Everything is still there. All of the papers, all of the furniture, all of the original wood. It's been a lot of damage over the years, but we've retained most of it. And I love when I go there on vacations and stuff, I love to look through all that stuff. It's just like, you can get lost for days doing that. One day, I came across, there are a lot of old books, I came across this book, and I'm opening it up, and I look at this side over here, and I see a date. It says April 4th, 1791. Sitting in my hand. I'm like, whoa, I shouldn't touch this. This is like Essays on Rhetoric by Dr. Hugh Blair, his lectures, in the house of the people who were enslaved. Right? So, let me ask you, what does that mean? What do you think that meant? I'm still trying to figure it out, but what do you think it might have meant? That book was in that house. Anybody?
A connection.
Yeah, a connection. Somebody could read, right? It also meant someone knew the power of knowledge. Someone knew what Madison was reading. Someone knew what Jefferson was reading. They could read, and they wanted to read it itself because they understood where power came from. At the same time. So while Jefferson was going to Philly, somehow they did the same thing. I'm saying this not to say there's anything special about this family. That's not the point. I'm saying this to ask you, when you go to historic sites, ask yourself what really happened. All the decision making, the thinking, the engineering, the designing, the enlightening. How did it actually appear out of nowhere? How did Madison's neoclassical Greek columns get built by people who had never Madison himself had never been there. He never left the country. He came with a picture and said, build me this. And they built him Greece. But they were also reading about Greece. That's a story that's not told. And for those who couldn't read, the person who could read it to them. So people everywhere are thinking and being geniuses and being full human beings. And we are never taught that story, that part of history, are we? We're just taught a very pared down story. So, really what I'm getting at is something that really resonates for me at Montpelier. This has made me think about, this experience in the last 4 years has made me think a lot about institutions, about the Enlightenment. You know, the Constitution isn't a piece of the work of the Enlightenment. It's when, you know, ideas of evidence overtook traditional concepts of believing things just on faith alone. That you have to actually go through kind of scientific reasoning. It was that period. But at the same time, we had an institution called slavery. That wasn't an enlightened institution. That reproduced and perpetuated inequality at the same time. So Montpelier, for me, is this really interesting place, right? It's a place where two systems of power, and when I go there today, I still feel it. They contend. Two paradigms. One is liberty, which is in the Constitution, and the other is slavery, which is in the soil that produced the Constitution. And they're fighting. But it's the institution of slavery that is responsible for that paradox. So as we go through our thoughts about institutions, I think that what we should do is we should confront them, confront the paradoxes, confront head on that at the center of our history we have this tension, don't we? We have a country proudly, and there's no one more proud than me about our country. All of my ancestors fought in every single war this nation has ever had. But the country is built on this paradox of things and their opposites existing together. We hear more about one side and we're discouraged to think about the paradox. How did this happen? Oh, that's over, that's the past. It's not past. It's the tension out of which we live today. And we need to think about that, and we need to actually mine that paradox for insight, because that's where insight comes from. And doing that truthfully allows us to build better institutions. The institutional blueprints of the past don't have to be perpetual. They don't have to be recreated. Why not? Well, let me wrap up by telling you about how this story all worked out. After 3 years of fighting, of going back and forth with the board, very difficult times, finally, in May 2022, we won. And we got the board to agree to change its bylaws to allow the MDC, the Montpelier Descendants Committee, to elect at least 50% of the board. And that's very important. Elect representatives. Doesn't have to be, just like the definition of a descendant doesn't have to be a blood test person. You can elect anyone you want. I remember having an argument with one of the board members back in the day. So he was saying, James, what does this mean? Are you saying that the Descendants could elect a white woman from Nebraska? I said, they can elect whoever they want. They can elect your cat. Purpose of democracy, which was written into by this guy in the House, was we are free people and we can elect who we want to represent us. That's democracy. All we're asking is for parity. That's it. Don't be scared. We're bringing pizza with us. We're going to share it. So we finally won in May 16th, 2022. At that moment, I had already met with the Descendants, and we had a sheet of very prominent people we wanted to elect to represent us, some of whom were Descendants, some of whom were, they were very surprised that we wanted a white Madison descendant to represent us. A wonderful woman who was proud of her relationship with us and believed and supported us 100%. It wasn't about the blood test, remember that. It's about representation. They didn't vote her on the board, by the way. They refused that. So we took a majority of the board, and then the board turned around and elected me chair. So I became the first descendant chair of any presidential site in the nation. And Montpelier, Montpelier became the first, and this is the more important thing, Montpelier became the first American institution to achieve structural parity. And so now it has become a governance model. It has become a gold standard for museums. I've given this talk not just to small groups, but also to Oxford University, to the British National Trust, to institutions around the world, and they're saying, scratching their heads, saying, why aren't we doing this? I can't answer that question. You should have been doing it a long time ago. There's nothing more Madisonian than this. This is Madisonian representative democracy, and it's an equity-based model. So it's not at all, a lot of criticism we got was, woke, woke, woke. It's nothing could be further from the truth. If you don't believe in what we did, you don't believe in the Constitution. This is equity. It is sharing power. It's not being scared of your neighbor. It's sitting down and sharing power. And it's worked. Now, after I was elected chair, I went on to raise $6 million from the Mellon Foundation, and we're doing a memorialization program, building a monument. We're investing a lot of money also into different ways of interpreting history and technology, etc. But I needed a rest. And after 4 years, I did my term as chair. I stepped down from the board, and now I founded a nonprofit that I told you about. This is the rubric. I encourage you all to read it, to get a copy. It's online. It's a free document. Anyone can use it. Very inspiring. And as you can see, it's 2018, produced by the National Trust that owns Montpelier. And this picture is a picture of my family's house that was built by my great-great-grandfather. And on the left, you'll see the front of the house, in the background. You see in the foreground, that pot, flower pot? That was the iron cast pot. We call it Grandma's pot. That's where Grandma cooked her wedding dinner. And it sits there. It sat there for 150 years. It's still there. And that's a picture of the L that comes off on the right. The L that comes off that J. Albert Brown's 10 children built as a gift to him after the Civil War. And it's called Brownland. The reason why it's called Brownland is that when James Barber died in 1842, even though, this is before the Civil War obviously, even though my ancestor was up to date in his payments, and it was public knowledge that he had sold the land, as soon as he died, his brothers, his stepbrothers and sisters, stole the bottomlands, where you can farm, right next to the river. And there was nothing he could do about it. So his name was Barber before, and as a protest, he changed his name to Brown because he lost his land because of the color of his skin. So the family name became Brown at that point, and he named, not us, he named his property Brownland, so we still call it Brownland to this day. I started a new nonprofit. It's called Brownland Leadership Solutions, and what we do is we're gonna kind of take this idea of governance, not necessarily looking at what we did at a historic site, but what we did by proving that there is a model of governance based upon equity that is appropriate and actually perfect for our times. Right now we're facing a time when people are starting to doubt and abandon some basic tenets of institutions, democracy being one of them, and there's a lot of doubt about whether it works. I'm here to tell you it works. It's the best thing we have, and we shouldn't lose confidence in it, and we should be more democratic, not less, more democratic, and think about reimagining our institutions and infusing them with more equity at the highest level of decision making. And that doesn't have to only be historic sites, right? So in March, next month, I'm invited to speak at, has anyone heard of South by Southwest? There's a festival, South by Southwest in Austin. I've never been, apparently it's, quite a thing. And they asked me to come and speak about this model. And so I said, I'll do it on one condition. If it doesn't just have to be about Montpelier, because I want it to be about today. I want it to be about what the institutional inequities that we face today, and how this model can provide an answer, or at least the beginning of a conversation. One of them is artificial intelligence. I know it's far away from what we're talking about, but AI is an institution. Has anyone used ChatGPT in here? One person back there? I use it all the time. It's incredible, isn't it? It's a little scary.
It's very scary.
Yeah. Well, are there any teachers here? Raise your hand. You're a teacher. Any other teachers? How old are your students?
Well, I'm actually a retired teacher.
Retired teacher?
Yes.
Okay. So you know that they're using ChatGPT to write their papers. No matter what question you ask them, doesn't matter. So access to knowledge is no longer a problem. The problem is, what knowledge? What is in the database? Whose story is being told? And how do you govern it? It's an institution. How do you govern it? So I'm going to be talking about that. And that question I'm going to be addressing through the frame of what happened between James Madison and the people he thought he owned. So thank you very much. I wanted to leave, I know I go on and on and on, I ramble. Do I have time for questions? Okay. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer some. Yes.
Could you give us a little more information on the actual descendants? The different families and how y'all come together, how often you see each other, and the different lines, how many lines there might be?
Well, so we know of about 200 descendants. immediate descendants. But as I said, remember there were 300 people through generations who had children, who had children, who had children, who had children. And they all intermarried. And so if you just do the math geometrically, there are a lot more descendants than we know about who are out there. So the MDC meets every month. They have a policy. I insisted that we don't have any type of test. We're not going to ask you to like prove anything. You could join. I mean, literally through that definition, because one of the criteria for joining is just supporting the work. You know, because if you support the work of a community, in a way, you're part of the community. If you're sincere, that's what a community is, right? But on a regular basis, we have about, I don't know, I would say 50 to 100 individuals who are very active. And then more than that, we're more periodic. And we have, we raised some money. We're going to be doing more outreach. You asked how often do they meet? About monthly. There is a board. There is there's a membership kind of pool, and then they have something called an affiliate membership, which I'm not too sure. When I left the board in Montpelier, I left the NDC as well, and I think that I had done my time. So, but you check them out, and if you're interested, I'd be happy to connect you with them. You can look them up online, Montpelier Descendants Committee. They have a website, and they'd be happy to hear from you. Yeah.
So since the name changed to Brown, and they were barbers, do they still remember the connection? And do they still remember the connection, the history?
Who are you referring to? Does who remember?
The Descendants.
So that's me.
Yes.
Yes.
And that's your mission, to teach.
Well, I have a private mission, which is to dig into our history, and that started with my mother. And we have mountains of things I haven't read yet at home, and we're digitizing them. But yes, I would like to meet some barbers, but they kind of left. So after the Civil War, the barbers were very, very prominent people. I mean, James Barber's son was the president of University of Virginia, and his sister, the president's sister, Cornelia, got married and moved to Baltimore. She married a lawyer in Baltimore and became very wealthy. But the irony is that she was the only one to gain wealth after the end of slavery. The others who had kind of stayed in Virginia, who had all relied on the plantation, they didn't adapt. And so they either migrated somewhere, some of them went west. There's a Barbersville, West Virginia. You may have, I forget who I was talking to about this earlier today. Have some of you heard of Haley Barber in Mississippi?
Yes.
He's a barber. His family came down, his ancestors came down, he was a white barber. Yeah, and after the war, they came on down, like they followed this whole migration when these lands opened up, right? So I've never met a barber, and I'd love to meet a barber. I really would. If you know any, send them my way. Yeah, we keep trying.
So what documentation did you have for you to trace your connections to the bombers?
The fact that my grandfather lived. I mean, we have just my grandfather's existence. He was the son of a daughter of the Barbers. So it's immediate history. It's not far family history. So it's in our oral history, but it's also in our documented history. So we have all the documentation in our house. We have the deeds. I can show you if you want. It's very sad to see, but I have the slave registries
Okay,
of James Barber where Priscilla's name is right there.
okay.
And it's all documented. Yeah. Yes, sir.
So I want to make sure I heard you correctly. I'm going to make a statement first.
Sure.
From the sources that I've read, average plantations in this part of the country, Mississippi, Alabama, North Carolina, 20 to 25. Average size of plantations, 20 to 25 slaves. You said 300.
Yeah, that's why I was saying he's a billionaire. So he had about 300, they say between 250 to 300. And we have flown planes and over Montpelier using LiDAR. What's the word I'm thinking of? LiDAR. And counted hundreds of graves. And it's documented also in the slave registries. But so you have the Barber had more. Barber had over 1,000 slaves. So this was a the wealth in that part of the country at that time of this country's history was astronomical. Absolutely. The largest cemetery in the Atlantic world, slave cemetery, do you know where it is? How big it is? It's in Barbados. Yes. And I forget how many, it's just a couple hundred. It's maybe 300, 400. So this is one of the biggest places of interment in the Atlantic world. It's a major site of slavery. Major. Does that answer your question?
It does, and it just, when I think about the lack of fairness and inequities
Yes.
that's founded on wealth, we're still experiencing that same phenomenon.
This is the institutional origin. And that's why I speak a lot about institutions. That was the blueprint for our institutions. So that's how institutions were governed then. So the people literally people who lacked all freedoms whatsoever had no say in anything. And that was normal. That was how it was done. And that is not appropriate, even from the institution's point of view. If you want to be in today's world, if you want to be more profitable, I'll use that word. If you want to be a more successful, resilient organization, if you're out of touch with the people who you are selling to, if you don't allow them into the decision-making process, you're less stable. You're less informed. You can't see what's around the corner. And so an institution, and now this is the Darden in me speaking now, the business person. So an institution that doesn't strive for parity is a weaker institution. And so this is why I think it has resonance throughout all of our sectors in today's society. Yes, Joe.
I want to add input to your question. I think when we look at those numbers, your 25 to your 300, you got to think about cumulative versus the number at the time the count was taken.
Yes.
So, is your 25 just 25 at the time the count was taken, or was that cumulative? Is your 300 the number that he owned at the time the count was taken, or was that cumulative? So, yeah, that's all.
Well, so a lot of things, you're right, you have to take, is it a snapshot in time or not? Remember, his business model changed in the 1820s. So he started selling people, he started selling children. And he had to replace them. And so it wasn't just a number that reached the max at 300 and then went down from there. that it replenished itself as well. Because it was much more profitable to buy and sell than to have someone stay for their entire productive life because you couldn't grow the crops weren't working anymore. So the business model changed, the life cycle changed through time. What was working in the 18th century wasn't working in the 19th. There was another question over right here.
We're from a small museum in western Arkansas.
Okay.
And it's an old inn, but it's stagecoach route. The family, when they came from New Jersey, Pennsylvania, brought 2 slave families with them.
Right.
So we know they were slave families. When the museum was established about 50 years ago, it was just, I'm not sure there was an African-American family in the community.
Right.
It was white community that needed this preservation. And as the museum has kind of stabilized with funding and so forth, we realized that we really want to connect to the descendants.
Right.
And I tried to talk to a local African-American, he's, believe it or not, our local historian. And we looked at some of the African-American cemeteries. How else can we find these folks?
Can I give you a one-word answer? Churches.
Yeah.
Go to the churches. That's where you went to one place, cemeteries. Those are the dead. Go to the living. Churches are very institutions. They're institutions in the Black community. Speak to the institutions. And the institutions are powerful. And they have memory. And no one comes, and very few people have come and said, tell me your story. And I'm sure there could be some, I've seen skepticism, I've seen, who are you? Are you trying to make money off me? That type of thing. Just remember, that's a natural human reaction. So as you interact with people, make sure it's not transactional. Make sure you're sharing in the spoils of whatever it is that you want to talk about, and in the decision making, and in the info. That's all. But I'm sure people would be delighted for your interest.
There was a hotel, well, kind of a boarding house in our town, and it was on the Green Brook. And
Right.
so, again, a grassroots organization, which was established a few years ago, acquired the property, had to move the building, but in process of getting it as a kind of living museum, hosting speakers and so on and so forth. One of the churches was heavily involved in that, so now I know at least one to start.
Right. Well, that's,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It may sound simple, but I think if you haven't done that, that's where I'd start. Are there any other questions?
Can I just add
Yes,
a little
absolutely.
something? Another way when you talk about the community, the jobs that they did, if it was farming, whatever was booming in another town, here's the community. If one went for a job or farming or whatever they were doing, look in the next counties, and then look at the migration during that time period.
Right.
I got a phone call about, and I think I know about where that place is, but people migrated.
Absolutely.
And wherever it is, it's the next state. Oklahoma, Kansas, Missouri. So when you look at those surnames, by chance, you'll probably find, a connection.
That's important to say. Thank you for saying that. Because I'm coming from Virginia, and this part of the country was the source of the Great Migration. A lot more so than Virginia. And in the Great Migration, kind of the endpoints were the big cities in the north. So you might want to go to Chicago.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? And that could be Chicago churches. I'm being very serious.
No, we had one, record of, one of the slaves who had contacted the family, the white family. He said he wanted to come home, and he was quite ill and so forth. But, we don't even know his last name.
Right.
And so, yeah, I mean, but I think we know where he came from. Was it Ohio? Was it Missouri? I don't even say Missouri, but anyway, yeah, we've been working on it, but it's slow progress.
I gave you a little bit of a simplistic answer before, and I'm sorry, but I know some others who have been in your situation. There's a professor at Columbia University who's from a Jewish family that came from Louisiana, I think, I want to say. His ancestors from Louisiana, and they used to own a plantation. And he's trying to reconnect and find out the stories of the descendants. And where he started in Louisiana was the courthouse records. So he took the plantation records and went to the courthouse to see if he could match names. So those are source documents you could look at as well. Plantation records, and those are generally available. There's a big project, what was it? Where plantation records were scanned across a lot of the South. Do you know what I'm talking about? Anybody know what I'm talking about? So there's it was a couple of decades ago with a big initiative, and most of the plantations have had their records scanned and entered into databases. Yeah, it was very small. Yeah, right. But courthouses, churches, looking at the patterns of migration, looking where the cities they went to, that's where they prospered. That's where there'll be records. So those are just some ideas.
Thank you.
Every situation is very different. Did you have your hand?
We have, Freedom's Bureau records also.
Yes. Yeah.
Possibly have more better names.
So Freedmen's Bureau records are very rich. You're right. There's so many more records today than there were just 10 years ago as well. And even Ancestry, as silly as that sounds, I found a lot of my history, my family history, reflected on Ancestors. Like, oh, my mother was right. So you see a lot of that.
I still want you to check out Reverend Barber, the AME minister, and I don't know if he's in South Carolina. Where's Reverend Barber? Anybody know? But anyway, I'm sure you can find him online.
Okay. Yeah, happy to do
What is
it.
it? Is it William Barber, North Carolina? Yeah, Civil Rights, and the Poor People's Project, is that it? Poor People's
Okay,
Project.
I'll write it down later.
I found Will Barber.
My first comment.
Well, Reverend Barber just made the news a couple weeks, or 3 weeks ago, when he and his mother, I think is in her name, they went to see The Color Purple, and he has a handicap.
He does with his back.
Yeah, back, and he has a special chair that enables him to sit comfortably. People at the movie theater, for whatever reason, wouldn't allow him to sit in a special chair.
Really?
And so he protested, and they called the police and kicked him out.
Are you serious? That's incredible. Any other questions? Sure.
Just a comment, I'm from White County, which is about an hour north of Little Rock. And, so we've been trying to figure out amongst our historical society board, how to get some of the communities involved in what we have. We've got what we call Pioneer Village, which is the pioneer labels. It's not much later, it's really 1865 to 1920, the dozen buildings or so that we have all fall into that time period. But trying to figure out how to get these communities involved And then, what I learned from the program tonight is there is a way to self-evaluate whether, how you're making progress.
Right.
And, I appreciate what you're doing here, because it helps me understand that there can be a process.
There is a
That
process.
you can explain to others
Right.
the steps you take in order to make this happen.
Yes.
So I appreciate that.
Well, thank you. That it's important to remember that the rubric is there's no copyright on it, doesn't belong to anybody. It's a methodology. It's very adaptable, so there's no orthodoxy. You can adapt it to your own situation, to a small museum, to what you're talking about, or I'm going to adapt it to a whole industry. So it's really, it's very fluid in that sense, but it asks some great questions. There are things in it that I don't like, to be honest. You know, one of the things that it said was that the Descendants should form a committee that should be that should report to the board. Well, I don't want to report to the board. I want to run the board. And so I changed it. So you can take what you want, adapt it, and just let other people know, and I think that's the next thing for us to do, is to see how people are doing it differently. And that's something I'll be looking at too, just to see if we can have kind of a central place to look at the different applications of the rubric. It's really powerful.